Alrighty, well, welcome to Gaming the System, the only channel coming to you from the unique and unexpected intersection of gaming and theology. I am your host, Caleb Allen, joined by my co-host, Ryan Somerville, and our commanding officer, DJ No Greek, and our grunt, White Cocoa. I'll ready up so we can get this party started.
Let's do this.
Yay! Alrighty, so in our
We
last
who are
one,
about to die salute you.
yes, we are about to die. So in our last video, we took up the first 11 chapters and surveyed and summarized the historical redemptive historical significance and some key texts in there. Now we're going to turn and consider Abraham. So Ryan, take it away. Tell us about Abraham.
What do you want to know about Abraham?
Hey man, whatever you're willing to tell us.
Well, I mean, if we're attentive to what our last discussion was, it was all about that dynamic between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, those who call upon the name of the Lord and those who are essentially trying to make a name for themselves, right? That was the dynamic that we were discussing. So the story of redemption traces God's purpose to, through the seed of the woman, create a people for himself, to redeem a people for himself. And juxtaposed against that, contrasted to that, the foil for that would be the seed of the serpent, those who seek to make a name for themselves. That dynamic is established pretty convincingly in the first 11 chapters. It's quite obvious and intentional that Genesis is seeking to hold forth that dynamic, and it does so quite well. But when you come into Genesis chapter 12, that dynamic, or rather that, for lack of a better term, I guess, that literary construct shifts. It shifts from tracing the two genealogies to really beginning to focus in exclusively on the seed of the woman, particularly as it relates to Abraham. And when it comes to the seed of the serpent, or those who would seek to make a name for themselves apart from God, it's beginning. They'll take a second. They'll take a second part. They'll take a back seat, as it were, to the seed of the woman, to those who call upon the name of the Lord. And it begins with the call of Abraham. It begins with Abraham being a Chaldean from Ur of the Chaldees, and he's called out of that pagan environment for God's purposes. God comes to him in Genesis chapter 12, and he says that he is to get up out of his country, out of his father's house, and go to a land that I will tell you, and I will make you a great nation, and all of the nations of the earth will be blessed in you. And that begins God's, rather the tracing of God's definitive program in developing that people that he is creating to declare his praise, the prophets talk about, beginning with Abraham. And the promise of the woman's seed begins to find itself further expressed in Abraham. Because really, the story of Abraham is the story about the promised seed of Isaac, and the story about whether or not Abraham is going to have faith, a trust that God will bring about his promise. He promises to Abraham in Genesis 12 that in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through your promised descendant, through your promised seed, the seed of the woman. Which is interesting to note that the seed of the woman is highlighted there because as you progress through the Abrahamic narrative, it starts off with a promise being made to Abraham. But as you move through, as you get into Genesis chapter 15, that promise is meant not just for Abraham, well, actually Genesis 17, not just for Abraham, but it will be accomplished for Abraham through Sarah. right? So Sarah becomes a, a key factor in the completion of God's covenantal promise to Abraham, which really shouldn't surprise us. The seed of the woman to the patriarch is Isaac, the promised seed. So it's really interesting. That's really what Abraham is. He is the paradigm for essentially what is going to characterize the rest of the Old and the rest of the New Testament. The promised seed and faith in that promised seed being the condition for redemption, for salvation. Genesis chapter 15, God, or Abraham believes God with specific reference to the promise of that seed, the promise of the child, the promise of Isaac, and God counts it to him as righteousness. So and Galatians makes it quite clear, and Romans makes it quite clear, Romans chapter 4, Galatians chapter 3 and 4, that the promise to Abraham, that Abraham is the paradigm of faith that we are to possess in the promised seed, who happens to be Jesus Christ. So that idea in Genesis 3:15 of the seed of the woman really begins to have some flesh added to what are really bare bones, as far as the promise is concerned. As far as we call Genesis 3:15 the promise of the seed of the woman who crushed the serpent's head, the proto-evangelium, that is the proto-gospel, the first iteration of the gospel. And it's in Abraham and the Abrahamic narratives that we begin to see God's redemptive program through the promised seed begin to have itself fleshed out. So it's pretty fascinating if you read the Abrahamic narratives through that perspective. How much you'll learn beyond what you perhaps thought you knew. That just nice tales of Abraham being a faithful guy who believed God's promises, and that's all well and good. But what we fail to see oftentimes is that Abraham is a microcosm of the gospel itself. Believe in God's promise, particularly believe in God's promise of the seed. That seed being Jesus Christ, as Galatians 3 and 4 make quite clear, make quite evident. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd first to point out, this is in a lot of ways one of the richest aspects of Scripture. Really both the first 11 chapters that we covered last time and the life of Abraham. But sadly, they're often some of the most misunderstood. An example of that is I saw just a couple days ago on Facebook, someone posted this picture of what was supposed to be portraying Abraham as he's on Mount Moriah and about to sacrifice his son. And they commented that Christianity stems from or contains like a requirement to mutilate yourself and to murder your own child, or something to that effect. That's like Abraham was commanded to mutilate himself and to murder his child. But it really fails to understand and to grasp the point that was being made in that passage, but also the point that's being made throughout the life of Abraham. And that is that, God requires faith and obedience even when you don't understand it. But to do so willingly and out of a love for God, then it's not saying that, child sacrifice is okay. I mean, we know that God had every intention of not allowing Abraham to sacrifice his child. But it was important for Abraham to not know that at the time. Because it was a test of Abraham's faith, as it was Paul, I believe, who noted that trial was essentially a test of does Abraham believe that God is able to fulfill the promise that God made to him, even if his son dies. And we know that it had to be Isaac, because and by had to be Isaac, I mean the promise had to be fulfilled through Isaac. It couldn't be fulfilled through someone else, because I mean Abraham tried that. He tried asking that God would fulfill his promise through Ishmael, which was an offspring of Abraham, but not through Sarah. And God's response to that was no. Like you will have a seed, you will have a child through Sarah. So there's oftentimes a lot of misunderstanding that accompanies these passages, and it does everyone really well to learn the context. It's literary context first, but also it's theological context. Like what's the theological point being made by the text, rather than trying to insert your own theological issues onto the text.
That's really what it boils down to. The whole Abrahamic narrative is all about whether or not Abraham would have faith in God to be faithful to his promise, even when God asks him to do something that we would, of course, consider to be morally repulsive. But as Hebrews makes clear, that Abraham had faith that that God would bring Isaac back from the dead, which is a not very subtle reference to the fact that God would sacrifice his own son and bring him back from the dead, so that in that promised seed, the redemption of humanity would take place. So it's really all about joining two concepts. One, faith in God's promise. Two, particularly, faith in God's promised seed. So for Abraham, that's faith in God's promise and of the promised seed of Isaac. But for us, that's faith in who Isaac typifies, and that is ultimately Jesus Christ, the one who the angel's hand would not stay the hand of his father, but rather would be actually sacrificed for the sake of covering the sins of all of those who would believe in his name. So interestingly enough, Genesis chapter 12.
Hey, there's a guy
call of Abraham. Call of Abraham is really a gospel call. It's a call to Abraham for gospel faith, but it's also a call to Abraham for gospel obedience. He is to. It's hard to beat two people by yourself, but it's a call to gospel obedience. Just not just in terms of placing faith in God's promise, but also then living out that faith in front of other people. He was called to be a blessing as much as he was called to be blessed. So he was blessed with the gospel, but he was called to live out the gospel in front of the world in which he lived. You actually see that in Genesis chapter 12, which ends with him sacrificing sacrificing on the altar, in a land that is filled with pagans, and he doesn't have a small contingent of people with him. So it's going to be quite a public spectacle for Abraham to be sacrificing in the midst of this pagan land. So he is God, the one who's called to believe in God's promises, to exercise faith, but also to then, through the demonstration of that faith and his worship of God, be a blessing, a gospel blessing to those around him. So we actually have the gospel in the Abrahamic narratives played out in front of us in terms of three components. It's fascinating in terms of Abraham's faith being counted to him in righteousness. He trusts in God's promise of a seed, right, in Isaac, and that's what's counted to him as righteousness. Beyond that, he is called to be a gospel blessing, that is, to live out the gospel in front of the people that he will be living before in a foreign land, particularly in the way that he worships. And third, and often overlooked, because we really get condemnatory about Abraham, because the gospel, you know, in Abraham's life, in the Abrahamic narratives, is traced with his failures, right? Those are woven in amongst it. It makes the point that his righteousness isn't what's earning him these things in terms of his works righteousness, but rather God's grace covers the fact that he's an abysmal failure at times. So it's really a beautiful picture of God's promise to deliver sinful people through the promised seed, through faith in the promised seed, even in spite of their own sinfulness, of their own unrighteousness. And it's amazing to know that Genesis begins that pattern, holds forth that pattern before you're ever in Matthew, at the beginning of the New Testament, and the revelation of the one promised seed in Jesus Christ. So the gospel begins in Genesis, not in Matthew.
You know, there's another aspect that's also often overlooked, and that is Isaac's role, specifically as he's about to be sacrificed. You know, commentators have often pointed out that by this time, Isaac was at least a teen or preteen when he made the journey to Mount Moriah with Abraham, which means Abraham being an old man, Isaac could have, with his youth, if nothing else, made it very difficult for him to be placed on that altar, for him to be bound and then sacrificed.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, we find that he was actually a rather willing participant in the whole thing, which really ought to remind us and to cause us to think about Christ, the God-man, and his willingly offering of himself for our behalf. So just as Abraham is really in a lot of ways typifying that willingness on
Sucks. Sorry. Oh yeah.
He typifies that relationship. David, I've got shields for you. Isaac, at least in this instance, is doing the same thing through his willingness to be sacrificed. And so we're reminded then of the fact that Christ, and in his sacrificial offering of himself, he was not some unaware, unwilling participant in the whole thing, but he consciously and deliberately chose to take part in it for our sake.
Well, I mean, yeah, he trusted Isaac, trusted his father, right?
Right.
Trusted his father's purpose, trusted his father's plan, and left it at that. Didn't question him again. And that's exactly what we see happening. I think chapter 17, the high priestly prayer. Also think about, yes, you know, he prays that you know, not my will, but your done.
Right.
And that's what Isaac typifies. Is what Isaac represents. Because he asks his father, "Hey, what's going to be the sacrifice?" His father tells him that God will prepare one, and he leaves it at that, even to the point of being bound to the altar.
Right, and I think part of what we should take from that is that we shouldn't assume that Isaac and Abraham were just some like unwitting and puppets on a string. Like there was at least a degree to which they understand the ramifications of what was going on. Even if they didn't understand fully and they didn't see what all it was pointing to, I think we have to grant that there was some acknowledgement of a great plan being fulfilled in their own life.
But yeah, again, it's paradigmatic. So Abraham is trusting the promise of God that blessing is going to come through the promised seed, which is Isaac. Right? And so he's willing to sacrifice his son in the realization of that promise, trusting fully that God will bring him back from the dead. And that's paradigmatic of the Father himself. Obviously, there are points of disanalogy. God knew perfectly well what he was doing, required, but he's willing to sacrifice his son in order to accomplish a redemptive purpose, in order to accomplish what would bring blessing upon humanity, right?
Right.
And then Isaac is the one who submits to the will of his father. Trusts his father, trusts that his father knows what he's doing, and he has implicit faith that his father will do what is right and what is proper. And that is exactly what we see in Jesus Christ. So Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22 become paradigmatic of the gospel itself. The relationship between God the Father and God the Son.
Yeah, so as we can see from what we've discussed so far, like there really is a richness and a depth of meaning that can easily be skipped over and missed if we aren't careful to observe.
Yeah, and beyond that, well, I should say not beyond that, but in addition to that, we can skip over that meaning, but when we skip over that meaning, we're skipping over the point of all of the scripture. And so thus we are, from the get-go, beginning to approach scripture in a way that's foreign to its intended purpose. Through the types and shadows of the Old Testament, through paradigms and analogies, to point to Jesus Christ and reveal him to the. So if you don't have that as your driving hermeneutic, I probably should explain that term. Hermeneutic being the principle by which you interpret and understand scripture. If you don't have that as your driving hermeneutic, your driving paradigm as you are reading scripture, that God is working out in history his plan of redemption, seeing that as it unfolds in scripture, as it's laid out from Genesis to Revelation, then you're missing the point of the Bible. You're missing the point of scripture. So it's really important to see scripture for what it is, for what it's trying to accomplish. That is to lay out God's purpose in redemption, both in the way that he accomplishes redemption, but also in the way that redemption works itself out in the practical lives of his people, which we'll get to a bit later as we move through the Pentateuch.
Yeah, and you know that as a side note, that goes to show us that it really does matter how one interprets Scripture. In our, especially in our American evangelical society, like we're tempted to try and say that like, oh well, something is just your interpretation, and we want to go with this idea that all interpretations are valid, but they really aren't, because there are interpretations out there that miss the theme of Scripture itself.
Yeah.
We wanna be careful not to do that. David, there's a shield pod down here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also don't want to take the scriptures and turn them to a sanctified Aesop's fables. What I mean by that is, what were Aesop's fables? Well, they were mythological stories told for the purpose of teaching a lesson. And while we have a lot of Christians who pay lip service to the fact that, okay, we don't see these as fables and myths, we're treating them in the same way as Aesop's fables in terms of function. Like basically, yeah, all this stuff happened, but its only real purpose is just to kind of give us morals to live by. But it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
So much more than that. To be cognizant of that.
Can you carry them? I've got 2 first aids.
I got another first aid over here. I have 2 big shields.
Oh.
John Mark drop out?
No, it booted me on this last game. Sorry, my dad called and I've been on the phone for a second.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah. I think I was trying to send a message to somebody, and whenever I pull up the Xbox screen, it kicks me from being ready, and it sent y'all without me.
Oh yeah.
Let's see.
That's happened to me several times. It's annoying. Like I think we could say that's a bug that should be fixed.
Honestly,
I should be able
I
to
kind
pull
of find
up
it.
my Xbox menu.
I find it kind of funny, just because I can pull up my Xbox button in game, no problem. But
Right.
when getting ready for a game, it's like no.
All or nothing.
telling you.
Oh, wow. Nice, Dave. Beautiful.
What happened?
Poor guy. Didn't know it was coming. He just annihilated someone who didn't know he was there. It was a thing of beauty. I enjoyed watching it.
Instant death?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Dave,
it's-
John Mark, you have absolutely no thoughts
can't-
to add
I can't get up
to
there.
what you see when you're reading Genesis 1 through 12 and the Abrahamic narratives? Nothing at all? Even if it disagrees, which is perfectly okay.
We might tell you you're wrong, but
There's guys southwest of us.
Well, to be fair, I've only heard about half of it because I wasn't listening while my dad called. So.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, Dave, you've been here for the whole thing, and you are conspicuously silent. Because I don't know an Allen that keeps his mouth shut, to be honest.
they don't exist.
No, that's okay. I keep my mouth shut on anything.
Well, you've proved that through this whole escapade, so.
It also helps that I army where being silent is silent.
I don't know if it's just me, but I can barely hear David.
Yeah, I can barely hear Dave, too.
Hey, David, we got tangos at 164.
Where? In the house?
No, running left to right, 175.
Oh, they built across the river or the lake. I see it.
There's a pulse grenade. No, it was someone on this side of the river.
Well, I don't know, Caleb. If no one else has anything to add, I think essentially we're done since we're really not trying to be overly exhaustive.
Right. So, what I would recommend then, since we're not covering every little detail, pick up a Bible. It would be good to read through and familiarize yourself with the story. Die. To familiarize yourself with the Abrahamic story, and to pay attention to some of those themes that we've brought up. I'm sure it'll turn out to be a very worthwhile endeavor, and one that'll be greatly encouraging. So if you,
Hey, Caleb,
if you
Caleb, there's minis over
yes.
here. And here's a
If
big
you've-
shield.
If you've enjoyed this this episode and this discussion, we would encourage you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more as we continue taking.
Subscribe and tell
Taking
people
this-
about it.
Yes, definitely tell people about it. Subscribing is not enough.
Hey, we got-
Share the videos.
We got somebody behind us. Coming
Okay.
up towards us.
Yes.
Got him.
That was
Not coming
beautiful.
up no more. Alrighty, so
Yeah, I need 'em-
until next time, we will catch y'all later. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, share the videos, and show us some love and support in any way that you can think of. But we'll catch y'all later.
Take it easy.
Sorry, I wanted